Alright guys, we got a fun video topic today. We're going to be talking about 2D games that went 3D before returning to their 2D roots. Yes, we're going to be talking about 3D games that returned to the 2D space. 2D was all the rage to the first generation of gaming or so. I mean, after all, it was really all they had, but it was still considered breathtaking going from something like the NES to the Super Nintendo. However, even during the Super Nintendo, we could tell that 3D gaming was going to be a thing, looking at video games like Star Fox, for example, being an early trailblazer into the 3D space. So by the time we got to the 5th generation of gaming, think late 90s now, you're in the PS1 and the N64 era of gaming, 3D had really taken over. I mean, Nintendo basically designed the N64 around Super Mario, one of the first full-fledged 3D games that really captured the space really well. But despite 3D being the next brave frontier, some franchises still clung to their humble beginnings. I think of franchises like Yoshi on N64, Kirby on N64. Those games were just super polished 2D platformers. However, move just one generation forward, up to the GameCube, the Xbox, the PlayStation 2, the Dreamcast era, almost everything is 3D now. And if you were a 2D franchise, you probably were left to die if you could not make the leap to 3D. However, it's important to remember that time is a circle. Despite having modern marvels such as VR, we have virtual reality, and still some franchises insist on going back to the 2D plane. It almost doesn't even make sense. But for today's purposes, we're going to be looking at franchises that did start off 2D, leaped to 3D, and then returned back to 2D. And for the sake of this video, 2.5D will count. So let's start the list off with maybe the most iconic character to do it, Super Mario. Yeah, for you guys who've been around long enough, you remember Super Mario as a 2D platformer. His first 4 or so games are him foraying it in the 2D space. But let's give Mario credit. Right now, he is nailing both sides of the coin. Just look at his time on the Nintendo Switch. In the 3D space, he's arguably never been better than Super Mario Odyssey. In my opinion, that is still one of, if not the best games on the Switch, one of the best games of all time. It's a masterpiece. Yet, this guy is so sly that we've been waiting around for Mario Odyssey 2, and what do they give us? Super Mario Bros. Wonder, a return to the 2D plane that Mario knows so well. Now, this isn't the first time he's done this either. Going from the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo, on the N64, he was one of the early trailblazers, with Mario 64, like I've discussed before, being a 3D entry, and then Sunshine was GameCube, the Wii was Galaxy, but on the Wii, there was still the new Super Mario Bros., which was a return to 2D, hence the name Super Mario Bros. And he had a successful entry in the 2D space that spawned multiple spin-offs thanks to the DS and the 3DS, but still when we get to the Wii U, he's now in Super Mario 3D World and Super Mario 3D Land, and as the name suggests, he's back in 3D. And how does he follow up that? Again, he does Mario Odyssey before ultimately having the new Super Mario Bros. Ported over to the Switch and then giving us a new game in Super Mario Wonder. So he's one of the better case studies on how to take your genre from a 2D space to a 3D space, and even back into a 2D space very masterfully. So we got to give it up to Mario, still the king of gaming for reasons like that. He can just do it all. Next up is Kirby, and Kirby is kind of cheating. Up until the Forgotten Lands, I thought Kirby was doomed to be a 2D platformer and nothing else. And I'm not complaining. Kirby is probably my favorite 2D side-scroller. So anytime we get a Kirby side-scroller, it's still going to be a good time. However, his first several games were all 2D side-scrollers. but he's had a couple attempts in the 3D space. One of the more notable ones being Kirby's Air Ride. Right when we got to the GameCube and it was like, okay, it was cute Kirby, we let you do a 2D side scroll on the GameCube. We really need you to step it up and bring us a 3D adventure game, which I know a lot of you will probably point out that Kirby's Air Ride wasn't originally intended to be an N64 game, but yada yada yada, that is not this video. Ultimately, it gets brought to the GameCube. Kirby's forced to be in a 3D plane, and it's one of my favorite GameCube games of all time in Kirby's Air Ride. And again, how would he follow up his big 3D debut? Well, on the Wii, where he returns to Dreamland, and Epic Kirby's Yarn, where they're both 2D side-scrollers. So Kirby has done the 2D into the 3D, now back to the 2D. And of course, we've seen on the Switch, he's had Kirby All-Star Kirby Star Allies, which is a return to 2D platformers. Return to Dreamland has been ported over, and he's gotten Forgotten Land. So on the Switch, he has been able to pull off 2D and 3D. So again, give the Pink Puff some credit. He's been able to kind of bounce between the 2D and 3D plane pretty darn well. And with how well Forgotten Lands has sold, I'm interested to see if Kirby has earned the right to stay in the 3D space, or if he's going to get relegated to another 2D game when the Switch successor arrives. Next up is Prince of Persia. This is probably one of the franchises you thought of when you saw this video, mostly because earlier this year Prince of Persia released on the Switch with a 2D side-scroller. But for those of you that don't know, Prince of Persia actually started way back in the day, probably like the 80s. It was a computer side-scrolling adventure platforming game, and to its credit, it does look like one of the more fun games to go back and play during this time period. And Prince of Persia was originally a trilogy, the third game being its bold take in the 3D space. And I looked up some gameplay footage of it, and it actually looks pretty cool. But I think about how with the GameCube era, we had Prince of Persia and the Sands of Time, and that game is awesome. I gotta give it credit for making the transition from 2D to 3D so masterfully. Like, this game, this is one of those like certified classics, if you know, you know, underrated hidden gems. Prince of Persia Sands of Time is an awesome game, and at a time when so many franchises are just dying because they cannot make the jump from 2D to 3D, Prince of Persia comes in, does it masterfully, gives us another trilogy. But you know, that trilogy ended a long time ago. I think that trilogy ran through the GameCube and PS2. Since then, it's been rebooted, I believe, 3 times. I think it got a Wii boot and a reboot on the 360. It's like the last video when I said a Wii make. I think it got a Wii boot and a remake on the or a reboot on the 360 before ultimately getting rebooted one more time on the Switch as a 2D platformer. So Prince of Persia perfectly encapsulates what I'm talking about here. Starting off as a 2D side-scroller back in the 80s before becoming a 3D platformer in the early 2000s, and now with your next reboot, you are back to being a 2D platformer. Alright, the last game we're talking about today is a little cheating, and that's Megaman. Now, some of you may be like, whoa, 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 whoa. What is he talking about? And some of you may be like, yeah, what is he talking about? So, Megaman, as we all know, started off as one of the most iconic franchises on the NES. So, of course, it laid the blueprints for an action shooter side-scroller game. And if I'm not mistaken, had 6 entries on the NES and several more on future consoles. And so some of you may be thinking like, okay, well, where does this thing shift to 3D? I'm looking at Mega Man 1 through 10, and they're all side-scrollers, which is why I say maybe you think it's cheating. Mega Man had several spin-offs, and those spin-offs dip their toes in the 3D space. Now, to me personally, the one I think of is Mega Man Legends / Mega Man 64. It is a full-fledged 3D game with an open city and a tunnel system, and awesome music, NPCs, atmosphere, weapon upgrades. I really did enjoy Mega Man 64. But it's not a part of the mainline series, and the mainline series stayed 2D. I mean, this blew me away. I think there were 2 Mega Man games developed for the PS3. There's at least one. I'm pretty sure Mega Man 9 was developed for the PS3. And when you look at gameplay footage, it's all retro. The music is retro. The levels are retro. The graphics are retro. The controls are retro. Everything about it looks like it was made for the NES, but it was made for the PS3. But there's an 8-year gap in between mainline Mega Man games, like twice. I believe there's an 8-year gap between 8 and 9, and another 8-year gap between 9 and 10, if I'm remembering this right. And by the time we get to the Switch, it's still a 2D platformer. So, as far as the mainline games go, we never saw the Blue Bomber do a 3D game. However, his spin-offs were 3D, which is really just interesting to think about, that the mainlines never ventured outside of the 2D space. Whether you're talking about designed for the PS1, the PS3, or the Nintendo Switch, it's all been designed in a 2D space, whereas his spin-offs are the ones that have been 3D games. So maybe Mega Man's cheating. I'm not sure. I'll let you guys decide that down below. But it is really interesting to see how one of the most iconic franchises of all time by one of the best studios of all time has never strayed from his roots during the main line entries. Mega Man 1 through 10 are all 2D side-scrollers, despite them tackling the 3D space in spin-offs. I mean, he even had a soccer game back on the Super Nintendo, if you want to count that as 3D. I don't know. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Okay, so that's the 4 franchises I wanted to talk about today. It's worth noting that this video will get a part 2. I'm sure many of you guys have plenty of franchises you're thinking of off the top of your head. I don't want to name drop too many. I mean, we know Metroid, right? We know it did Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime 4, and yeah, Metroid will definitely be in part 2. So give me some suggestions for some franchises that started off 2D, hopped into 3D, and then went back to 2D. So thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Leave me some video suggestions down in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next exciting video.